91b Tzadik Aleph Amud Beis. Continue with the apparent presented contradictions in the verses, and in their clarification we get better understanding of the time of the resurrection of the dead. And from there the Gemara gets to, generally speaking, analyzation of verses, which in and of itself requires understanding as to how we float from one to the next, and not just the tenuous connection of the fact that they have to be analyzing verses. So otherwise you can put half of the Gemara in here. Okay, so we are the line begins with the word Shechina, and then the second word is Rava. It's Tzadik Aleph Amud Beis 91b, and it's about a third from the bottom of the page. Yeah, Yosef, you have it.
The first word of the whole sentence. Yeah, I found it.
The first word of the line is Shechina, and the second word is Rava.
Yeah, down.
Okay, beautiful. Rava Rami. Rava raised the following apparent contradiction. Ksiv, the verse reads, Ani Amas ve'echya. This is in Devarim Lamed Beis Lamed Tes, and God is speaking through Moshe that see me now, I am that I am. There is no other God with me. I bring death, I give life. I bring sickness, I bring healing, and there's nothing apart from me. Ein biyadi matzil. No other salvation outside of me. So, in the context of the resurrection of the dead, the pasuk which says Ani Amas v'echya, I give death and I give life. Well, let's back up a second. The verse could have or should have read, I give life and I give death, meaning life comes first. And yet the verse reads, I give death, I give life, implying that there's a life after death. So there's an allusion already there to the resurrection. Now Rava is deriving from this that in the way the person dies is the way he returns.
Where's that verse from, sorry?
Deuteronomy 32:39.
Parshas giving the history of the Jewish people from the beginning until
Right, so that's why I said it's Hashem speaking through Moshe. I mean, it's always Hashem speaking through Moshe, but over here it's Moshe reviewing, as is the Var. So, what Rava's reading from this verse, I bring death and I bring life, and that the life that follows after death, namely the resurrection, is exactly as death. That is to say, the sicknesses and the manner in which the person passed is how they return. But then the Ksiv, the very same verse says, Machatzti, I bring illness, Vani Erpa, and I bring healing, implying that the way the person returns, given that now that we've established that that's the context of the verse, it's talking about the resurrection, that it would seem like the person returns healed. So on the one hand, the same verse seems to imply that the return is the same way the person was buried, with whatever sickness that they passed, and the next verse implies that the person returns healed. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu. So in resolving this contradiction, Rava explains that the verse means as follows. God says, Ma'ashani meim is that which I have put to death, ani machaya, I bring back to life. Again, as we said, because the verse begins with death and then life, as opposed to life and then death. V'hadar, and then follows, Mashem machatzti, that which I have brought sickness, ani erpa, I heal. So the resolution is that the person indeed returns to life with the sicknesses the person passed with, but then the next step is, good morning, the next step is that the person gets healed. So it's two miracles. The person returns to life and then healing. Okay. Tana Rabbanan. We'll read the next line and we'll perhaps give some explanation here. Tana Rabbanan, our sages taught. So Rava, of course, is an Amoda, that is to say, a sage of the generation of the Gemara, actually from almost the last generation of the Gemara, towards the end. And now the Gemara is introducing a text Tanur Rabbanan, our sages taught, introducing Mishnaic egg text, which supports this notion. Namely, Ani Amis Ve'achya. The verse says, as we just read, I give life, I give death, and I give life. You have it? Here. Yachal Shetei Misa Be'echad V'chaim Be'echad. You might suggest that the verse is speaking, which is implied in the simple reading of the verse, that when the verse says, I bring life and I bring death, it doesn't mean specifically about one person. She's generally speaking. I bring death to this guy and life to that guy. Meaning I bring death and life throughout the world, not specifically talking about one person returning. So you might think that that's what the reading is, and that's the way it would seem on the simple level. So perhaps you might suggest the verse is referring to death for one person and life for somebody else. Meaning I provide everything. For some people it's death, for some people it's life. That's the way as the world runs. So where do we know that the verse is talking about the same person and the resurrection? Meaning to say, notwithstanding what we said earlier, that by the fact that the verse says life after death as opposed to life before death, one could still read it means different people. Death to this one, life to that one. And it's referring to the way the world stands right now, not from the beginning. So the world stands right now, there are people that are alive, and they will die, and there are other people that aren't born yet, that will be born. Finished. But says the Mishnaic age text that the verse itself implies we're talking about the same people. How's that? Talmud Leimer, then the very next line comes to teach you, Machasti v'nei erba. I bring sickness and I bring healing. Just when it comes to sickness and healing, it's the same person. Because there is no healing without sickness first. So when it comes to life, you could interpret the verse that there's life for one person, death for somebody else, and they're two different people. But when you say sickness and healing, and over there the order obviously can't be the healing first and then the sickness. Healing for who? There has to be someone who's sick.
Somebody can be sick, the other one is not sick.
That's the point. Which means when the pasuk says, Hashem says, I the one who brings sickness and I'm the one who brings healing, it's talking about one person.
What? Can it
because nobody gets healing without sickness first. So whoever got the healing got sick first. If there's no sickness, there's no healing. So it's we're talking about one person. Right? Just like sickness and healing comes from happens with one person. It's possible that one person gets a sickness without a healing. That's true. But anybody getting a healing had a sickness first, which also came from Hashem. So now that we've established from the fact that Hashem says, I'm the one who brings sickness and I bring healing, then it's talking about one and the same person, or it includes one and the same person, not limited to. So therefore, Af Misa, V'chayim, likewise, the death and the life, Be'echad Mikan is talking about Be'echad, one person. Mikan, from here, Tshuva is a response to those who say, Ein Tchias Meisim in the Torah, there's no such thing as resurrection of the dead from the Torah. You'll remember we began this discussion from the Mishnah, which says that someone who denies the resurrection of the dead sourced in Torah doesn't take part in it. Meaning, even if he believes that Hashem will resurrect the dead at the future time, but if he doesn't believe that it comes from the Torah, this person, under the right circumstances, we explained in previous classes, doesn't take part in it.
Are you talking about Rambam?
The Rambam takes it from the Gemara here.
Rambam takes it from this Gemara.
Yes.
Okay.
As all of his rulings come from the Gemara, right? This and this specifically about that time.
Definitely.
So,
He has a source, see?
So here, the source is the Mishnah. So here the Gemara tells us that this is a response to those who want to deny it. Here's a verse which implies that one person gets sick and gets healing, and likewise one person gets death and gets life. Okay, so now let's look a little bit deeper, yeah?
Another quick point. Is it proper to use the word resurrection as opposed to revivification?
I didn't use the word revivification, but...
Okay, I'm just saying, we hear a lot about Christianity, about resurrection.
You want me to change the word?
I'm just raising a question with you.
No, I actually, personally, I don't like this idea of, because they hijacked it, therefore I get to lose it. They hijacked it, let them change what they talk about.
Okay.
This is my idea to begin with. Not mine, me, but the Jewish people.
No problem.
It's their problem.
Okay.
Although we have had classes here earlier where we discussed the difference between resurrection versus reconstruction. Is it the same person, or is it the same body, or different body? We have had some talks about that, which might lend itself to the language we use, but we'll stick with the resurrection at the moment. Okay. So let's look a little deeper here. And we'll begin with opening the question, why indeed is it in the first statement of the Gemara from Rava, where the Gemara said that there are stages. First, the person returns to life, and then there is healing. Why not, as was suggested at the beginning in his question, just resurrect healed? Why first resurrection with sickness and then get healing? What's the point? So I don't know the answer to that directly, and I suppose that's Hashem's choice, obviously at the end of the day, although of course there's a meaning and reasons behind it. But I might suggest what we say, al pi avoda, meaning to say, there's a certain way of learning, Torah in general. Specifically, this is true in a certain strain of Hasidic learning, where I don't think we've used this method before. Usually, when we explain things according to Chassidus, we talk about it in the philosophical sense, using the philosophy of Chassidus and explaining the Gemara. But here, we're using the philosophy of avoda, meaning to say, in addition to their philosophical discussions, everything in Torah has a message in the way we serve Hashem. Right? So here is a talk about the resurrection and how it's going to happen. And of course there's philosophy and layers of insight in just the abstract study of what's going to happen. But in addition to that, there's a message to the way we serve Hashem now from that abstract philosophy. And perhaps this idea of first being resurrected, revived, and then being healed has a message in our service of Hashem. As far as the philosophy behind it goes, I haven't come up with anything, but the floor is open. But at least for the avodah, I can share something perhaps. There's a famous medrash which Chassidus quotes often, in which, and it's actually in the Gemara and Brachas also, a little bit different there, with respect to the two chapters of Shema, in that Hashem says, the parable of a king who walks into a city, and they tell him, the ministers tell the king, advise the king, put your decrees, impose your laws on the city. And the king says, if they don't accept me as king, why am I wasting my time telling them to do things? So first, kabul malchusi, accept my sovereignty, and then gzeiraisai, my decrees. The Gemara and Brachas talks about this as the first two chapters of Shema, the first talking about accepting God's kingship, and then the second, mitzvahs. Similarly, we had this recently in an earlier class about Anochi and Layilacha, I am God your Lord, as in accept my sovereignty, and then comes the actual commandments. So, Chassidus explains that these two stages of accepting God's sovereignty and then accepting God's kingship, as obviously as it's clearly from the Medrash, two stages in the service of Hashem. Or, not two stages, but two layers, both of which exist always. One is an existential state, where a person devotes himself to Hashem. It's an existential state. It hasn't yet reached a point where we are specified in how you're going to serve God. It's just the notion that you have dedicated yourself to Hashem. In the terms of our year, this is Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, we accept God as King, right? And then without specifics of what we're going to do, and that's secondary almost at that point. The point is, we're accepting Hashem as King, Kab Malchusai, right? Say before me words of kingship, Kab Malchusai, that you should accept my sovereignty. And then we go out throughout the year, living by that acceptance, that stage or layer number two. Now the truth is, as this explains even forward, every individual mitzvah has both of these layers. On one layer, what's the mitzvah? The mitzvah is whatever that specific mitzvah is. So we recently learned about tefillin, and we talked about the messages of tefillin. So tefillin, on one level, is basically the dedication of the mind and heart to Hashem. It's specific to that mitzvah. But then on another level, what's tefillin? Tefillin is a request from Hashem. Okay, it happens to be tefillin. Right. So there's one thing that all mitzvahs have in common. It's God's will. It happens to be this, it happens to be that way, fine. And the line goes, if God asked us to chop wood, we chop wood. Then there's another layer, and that other layer is the specific that mitzvah brings to the table. This mitzvah brings my dedication of mind and heart. That's the tefillin. This mitzvah it envelops the person with the divine light, and this mitzvah does that. Every mitzvah has its own message. But they all share the common theme. And this parallels these two things, accepting God's sovereignty that leads to the fact that, well, it doesn't matter what you're asking me, it's your sovereignty. But then there is the specifics of accepting God's decrees, the second stage, not just accepting the sovereignty, but accepting God's decrees. And there, each mitzvah has a specific, unique mode of service.
We have to think all the time that Hashem is always omnipresent. We have to avoid to be anger, because this is avodah zarah.
100%. Now, these two things can match the two stages of the resurrection in the avodah. Bring revived, that's an existential state. The person who is extremely sick, God forbid, the person who was born 5 minutes ago, and the person who is a young, healthy man, are at the existential state all equally alive. That matches the fact that a person accepts God's sovereignty. Doesn't matter what level of mitzvah it is. It doesn't matter what level of intention you have in that mitzvah. The fact remains you've accepted God's sovereignty and you're following what He wants. It's the existential state. And then there is healing sickness. Okay, so the person's alive, but that specific mitzvah is lacking something. Let's heal that. You follow where I'm going here? And therefore we have, perhaps, why we have two stages. First, the resurrection of the dead. First thing is a person has to accept God's sovereignty. The first thing is a person has to be alive. He has to be connected to Hashem, right? Clinging onto God, that's true life. So the first stage in life is be alive, connect to Hashem, accept His sovereignty. Then comes healing. Okay, so now that you've accepted God's sovereignty, now that you're alive, now that you've dedicated your life to the service of Hashem, now let's look at the specifics of how you're serving Hashem. This mitzvah requires a little sharpening. There's a little sickness that we need to heal. We'll heal it. And so on. And perhaps that's why, at least in Avodah, in our service of Hashem, why there's these two stages. A first coming to life, and then healing. Which leads to the next Gemara. The next Gemara said that you might think that life and death are different people, and but from the fact that healing is the same person, that's when we know life and death is the same person. Remember that? That was the Gemara proved that. Yeah. Okay. So in Avodah, in this context, what does this mean? Perhaps a person might think that if I've left or if I've rejected the sovereignty of Hashem, and a person is, quote, in this context, dead, disconnected from Hashem, lacking life, lacking the life of Atam Adekim Hashem, lacking the life of connection to Hashem, so I might think I'm a lost person. The real life has to be someone new, a new entity. Can't be the same person. This person dies, another person's alive. You're out. So says the verse, no. In the same way you can heal the specifics of what you're lacking in your service of Hashem, you also have the capacity to completely revive your service of Hashem. And the life and the death can be the same person. The same person can reject the sovereignty of Hashem and thus be spiritual death. And that same person can revive himself. In the same way a person can fix the specifics of how he's lacking in the service of Hashem, he can also revive himself on the existential level and completely dedicate himself to Hashem, notwithstanding the fact that 5 minutes ago he completely rejected the service of Hashem and was in the spiritual death. So perhaps this is a way of reading the Gemara on a level of avodah, of our service of Hashem, even if it doesn't explain the philosophy behind it, which I'm sure there are layers and layers of that, and the floor is open for that as well. Okay, so that we begin the next section of the Gemara. Tanya, while on the subject of, or this has been the theme in general, finding sources in biblical texts for the resurrection of the dead, the Gemara now quotes what has perhaps become the most famous of them, even though it's not the first one the Gemara quoted. Tanya, we learned in the Mishnaic age text, Amr Rabbi Meir says, where do we have scriptural basis for the idea of the resurrection of the dead? Shenemar, as the verse reads, we say this every day in our davening, in our service before Yishtabach. Oz Yashir Moshe v'nei Yisrael as Hashira Zois Lashem. This is talking about, of course, when the Jews emerged from the splitting of the sea, and the verse reads, quote, then Moshe will sing, and the Jewish people this song unto God. So points out Rabbi Meir, the famous words, Shar Lo Namar. It doesn't say, then Moshe sang in the past tense, which is the way it should have been written. seemingly. Ella, rather, the verse reads, Yashir, he will sing. Mikan, from here we get the idea, Tches HaMesim, for the resurrection, Min HaTorah, from the Torah. That is to say, that Moshe will sing in the future time, along with the Jewish people who will come with him. And thus it's in the future tense, not past tense. In the appendix, not appendix, what's the word? Appendix, isophysis. Addendum, yeah. The additional sections to the back of Likutei Sichos, there was Magnum Opus of Volume 7, page 270 if you want to look it up. So it's kind of a sermon-esque style talk here, as opposed to the more usual Talmudic dissertations, if you will. It's kind of I'm imposing here, but it's sermon-esque in its style. This talk specifically. By the way, the fact that I quote the Rebbe all the time for learning Gemara is not because I know all the Rebbe's stuff by heart. I wish. There's a fellow, and it's important to give credit. There's a rabbi, a scholar named Rabbi Michal Zelikson. We once had the privilege of hosting him here for Shabbos, and he created an index of all the Rebbe's talks. So he has one section where he goes through the Talmud and gives you every page where you can find the Rebbe talks about something on that page. So when I prepare the Gemara, I look at that thing to see where the Rebbe talks about it, and I look it up. So it's not because I know all the Rebbe's talks by heart. I wish.
Wow.
At any rate, so going to give him credit for that.
It's all about oneness.
Yeah. So in this talk,
Echad.
the Rebbe says like this: it's a talk of Shvi Shal Pesach, of the seventh day of Pesach, and the seventh day of Pesach, of course, is when the splitting of the sea happened. And there the Rebbe says as follows: generally speaking, any Jewish event is not to be seen as something in history, but rather to be something that you connect with today. It's the famous teaching of the Baal Shem Tov on the Mishnah with respect to the Megillah, which says, the Mishnah in the literal sense is HaKoira es Megillah Mafreya, one who reads the Megillah out of order, hasn't fulfilled his obligation. You have to read the Megillah from beginning to end. You can't read it out of order.
The Book of Esther.
Book of Esther, on Purim night or Purim day.
Okay, I missed you.
On Purim, you have to read the Megillah in order, not out of order. That's what it means. But the word that the Mishnah uses for out of order means l'mafreya. That's the word that the Mishnah uses to describe someone reading the Megillah out of order. Now, the word l'mafreya also means backwards. So says the Baal Shem Tov, HaKoira es Megillah, one who reads the Megillah, l'mafreya, as something from past tense. Lo yotz hasn't fulfilled his obligation. You have to read the Megillah as a present tense message, not as a past tense message. This is true of every mitzvah, of every event, holiday, where we don't just remember it, we relive it and internalize its message to the best of our ability. But then, when it comes to the Exodus from Egypt, which culminates with the splitting of the sea, right? The famous line that they went out of Emas Mitzrayim, means the fear of. They technically left Egypt 7 days earlier, but the splitting of the sea, they left the fear of Egypt. The fear of Egypt disappeared from them. So even for the 7 days when they left, the fear of Egypt taking them over was still on them. And then Emes Mitzrayim they escaped from at the splitting of the sea. So the splitting of the sea is the culmination of the Exodus. So if every single holiday one is supposed to internalize its message, not in past tense, but in present tense, so when it comes to the Exodus, certainly. Why? Because the Exodus itself is all about breaking boundaries, going out of our limitations, transcending limitations. Not just transcending limitations, not just regular limitations, but even the limitations of time. The limitations of time, meaning to say, the event happened 3,500 years ago, and now I'm stuck here. The whole point of going out of the Exodus is that you transcend these kind of limitations. And you tap into the Exodus from Egypt as it happens now. Because you've transcended time. And thus, says the Rebbe like this, now you see the connection between the singing of the song to Tchis HaMesim, to the future redemption, to the resurrection. It's not, in other words, it's not just technically speaking, the Torah says the word, then he will sing. But actually, 1 second to finish, but actually, the singing then, because it was about breaking boundaries and transcending times, already includes the singing that will happen when Mashiach comes. It's one long song. And the song that was sung then which is what the literal meaning of the verse is. Even though here he interprets that it means then they will sing when Mashiach comes, the literal verse means they sang then. Even though it's written in the past, even though it's written in the future tense.
Always omnipresent, but
But that's the point. Because their exodus from Egypt is all about breaking boundaries. This song, this exodus transcends time. And it's always sung. Which explains also why our sages say, the verse is lemar to say. So what does lemar mean? Saying. Usually the word lemar, saying, means that God tells Moshe to review, to repeat the words later. So our sages explain what happened then. Moshe began and the Jews repeated a whole lot of different opinions. But one of the ways of understanding lemar, saying, is l'doros, for generations to come. Not just generations will repeat the song, but generations will sing this very song in that this song transcends time. So in the very song that Moshe sang then, which is the literal interpretation of the verse, it's already included the song that he will sing and the Jewish people will sing in the time of the resurrection. So the content of the splitting of the sea and the Exodus in general is connected to directly the resurrection and not just technically, as the verse says, and he will sing. Now I'm saying this because this is setting the stage. Tomorrow I have a bar mitzvah, so I'm not going to be here. But on Friday, God willing, we're going to learn more such verses where the verse says, then something will happen. And that word, then this will happen, is implication to the resurrection. And we're going to attempt, based on the Rebbe's reading here, that when the verse teaches us Tchias HaMesim, it's not just technically because it said then, but the content of the actual verse connects to the resurrection. We're going to attempt to do that, to make this kind of connection between the verses and the very idea, the very notion of the Messianic age in general and the resurrection specifically, to see if we can keep this flow of having a connection between the verse, from the verse, and then what's derived from the verse, the resurrection of the dead. All right, have a wonderful day, buddy. Yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, let's not forget that it says Az Yashir. It uses the Yud, which alludes to the future 10th song. So this is about songs.
10 songs, yeah, 10, Yashir.
Specific songs. And this is going to be the 10th song, the allusion to the 10th song. It's going to be sung at Tiffy.
Very beautiful.
Okay?
All right,
That's
thank
very
you.
deep.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.